Hello, I'm Trevor Langley. Welcome to Warwick Words History Festival online. I'm talking about Puckerings Lane in Warwick. It's a little lane with a big story to tell. Lots of people don't know, but this is the only street with that name in the whole of Great Britain, probably the world. It's only 82 metres long, and it's only got 4 addresses, and it's tucked behind the Master's Garden of Lord Leicester's Hospital. It's got a section of the old town wall at the southwest corner, and everyone who's local has been up Puckerings Lane, even if they didn't realise it. It now holds Warwick bus station. Until the 1960s, it was merely a footpath linking Bowling Green Street and Brook Street, running between some very old buildings which were in very poor condition. So, why does Puckerings Lane have an apostrophe? The only other roads in Warwick with an apostrophe are saints' names like St Mary's or St Paul's, St Christopher's or St Michael's, or roads connected with Earl Guy of Warwick, Guy's Close, Guy's Cross Park Road, Guy's Cliff Terrace. And there are only 2 other lanes in Warwick inside the old town wall, Back Lane and Castle Lane. All the others are streets or squares, and generally they tell you what went on there or where they lead to, like Church Street or Market Street, Castle Street, High Street, Market Square or Old Square. So why is it called Puckerings Lane? There are no other streets in Old Warwick named after a person or a family. So did Mr Puckering live here? Did the road belong to the Puckering family? Was it their private drive? Well, I can tell you from the start that not one of the Puckerings of Warwick actually lived here, and none of them are buried here. And why is it in this particular position? This little lane hints at their family story, even though it wasn't called this in their lifetime. So to understand the story behind Puckerings Lane, you need to know about 4 key characters, and they're all connected with the big stately house that used to stand in Priory Park. Sir John Puckering, Sir Thomas Puckering, Jane Puckering, and Sir Henry Puckering, a connection which began in 1582 and lasted until 1701. But their legacy lives on even today. A very important family that you may never have heard of. Before the Puckerings, the Priory had only had 2 owners, Thomas Fisher, real name Hawkins, the town recorder and local MP, who purchased the land in 1546 after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. And over the next 10 years, he built a grand house, which he called Hawkins' Nest. He was visited there by the rich and famous, including Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. And when Thomas Fisher died in 1576, his son Edward inherited the estate. For 6 years he squandered his father's wealth, and he died in a debtor's prison. In 1582, Priory House was purchased by Sergeant John Puckering, and thus began the Puckering connection with Warwick. Now, Sir John Puckering was born in 1544, the eldest son of William Puckering of Flamborough in Yorkshire. He became famous as Lord Keeper of the Great Seal for Queen Elizabeth. He married Jane Chowne, daughter of George Chowne of Kent. They had 3 daughters and 3 sons. 1 daughter and 1 son died in infancy. And he and his wife rebuilt and refurbished Priory House, but he spent little time in Warwick and he had very little influence locally. He was busy furthering his own career. In 1559 he was admitted to Lincoln's Inn at the age of 17, called to the bar 8 years later, then elected a governor, one of the last of the governors, and then he eventually elected reader, giving lectures on legal matters to other barristers. And in 1580 he was made sergeant at law. 1584 to 1587 he was the Speaker of the House of Commons. He was also MP for Carmarthen, then Bedford, then Gatton in Surrey, but never MP for Warwickshire or Warwick. He was heavily involved in the trial that led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1592, he was made Lord Chancellor and Lord Keeper of the Great Seal and knighted. He delivered the Queen's speech in Parliament in 1591, and in 1595 he entertained Queen Elizabeth herself at his villa in Kew. He also owned Russell House between Charing Cross and the Temple. By the time of his death, he had estates in Surrey, Hertfordshire, Warwickshire and Lincolnshire. On the 30th of April 1596, Sir John Puckering died of apoplexy, what we would call a stroke, at Kew. And he's buried in St Paul's Chapel, Westminster Abbey, in a very costly memorial paid for by his wife, Jane. Thomas Puckering was the third son of Sir John Puckering. He was born on the 3rd of December 1591. When his father died, Thomas inherited the estates, aged 4½, under the wardship of his mother Anne, for the sum of £33, 6 shillings and 8 pence. She settled into the Priory at Warwick. Thomas became a companion of Prince Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of James VI and I, King of England and Scotland. Prince Henry was being tutored by Puckering's brother-in-law, Adam Newton. He'd married Thomas Puckering's sister Catherine in 1605. Prince Henry died in 1612 and never became king. He had typhoid and died at the age of 18. Thomas Puckering was educated at Henry VIII Grammar School, Warwick. In his teens, he travelled widely through Europe and learned Italian horsemanship. In 1611, aged 20, he purchased the baronetcy of Weston in Hertfordshire at the suggestion of Lord Clifford. In 1612, he became a member of the North West Passage Company and was knighted Sir Thomas Puckering. His leanings towards Catholicism caused some concern. Severe poor health disrupted his foreign travel, and in 1615 his passport expired and he returned home and married, on the 2nd of July 1616, aged 24, Elizabeth, the daughter of Sir John Morley, with a dowry of £5,000. They had 3 daughters, and Elizabeth died in 1652. His hopes to work in the household of Prince Charles, later Charles I, came to nothing. He returned to his childhood home at Warwick Priory with his wife, and they derived an income from rents and money lending. In 1617 he became Justice of Peace for Warwickshire until his death. He was almost certainly a guest at the 3-day feast in Lord Leicester Great Hall for King James in 1617. In 1620 he was provided with a senior burgessship at Tamworth in December 1620 through Sir John Ferrers. And in 1621 he entered Lincoln's Inn and became a lawyer like his father. He became commissioner in Warwickshire and the Midland Circuit. Late in 1623 he travelled to London with his wife Elizabeth. She was weak and heavily pregnant with their first child. He had to stay in the capital for some time with her and therefore postpone his appointment as Sheriff of Warwickshire. In 1624 he presided over the county's parliamentary elections, and in 1623-1624 was appointed Sheriff of the county. Now, Thomas Puckering got involved in an argument with the Corporation of Warwick over tithes. He lost, but Warwick did not look kindly on him after that, and he was not elected as MP. Francis Lucy, son of Thomas Lucy, was elected several times in succeeding years. Puckering challenged the corporation but had to accept the seat in Tamworth again in 1625. He failed again to obtain the seat for Warwick in 1626 and continued at Tamworth. He was not always popular. 1627 he became Deputy Lord Deputy Lieutenant of Warwickshire until at least 1635. In 1628, he finally became Senior Burgess of Warwick. But when Parliament opened, he turned it down and represented Tamworth again. In 1630, he founded a hospital for 8 poor women in Warwick, the Puckerings Almshouse. In the 1630s, he worked with Robert Greville, Lord Brooke, and provided hospitality for the godly lecturer Thomas Dugard, showing that he was no longer of Catholic persuasion. Over many years, he and his wife both suffered from feebleness, faints and distemper, headaches and sleepless nights, relying on drugs and doctors' visits. In 1635, Thomas Puckering wrote his will. Their first daughter had died in infancy. The second girl, Cecilia, died in April 1636 at Warwick Priory and is buried in St Mary's. Her mother, Elizabeth, insisted that they move to Holnaker near Chichester in West Sussex, close to her brother, Sir William Morley. Sir Thomas Puckering's charity was founded by deed in 1633 to help poor families who could not afford the fee to apprentice their children to a trade. Puckering's buildings were called almshouses, even though they weren't conventional almshouses which usually housed the elderly poor. Now, one house stood in Rother Chipping, now called Brook Street, and the other in Woolwich, later called Bridewell Lane, now called Barrack Street. This was the start of the apprenticing charity of Warwick, which still operates today. The amalgamation of 5 such charities took place in 1930. The Brook Street building was sold in 1881 and demolished in the 1950s. It stood at the head of Puckerings Lane. Thomas Puckering died on the 20th of March 1637. He'd requested to be buried without ostentation during daytime rather than the fashion of by torchlight. He also left instructions for his black marble memorial in St Mary's, Warwick, with an inscription that he'd composed himself, similar to the one for his friend Sir Adam Newton in Charlton Church. It was to be built by the celebrated stonemason Nicholas Stone and cost £200. Stone had already been commissioned to build a tomb for Cecilia, his second daughter, in St Mary's, Warwick. On the death of her father on the 20th of March 1637, the estates passed to Jane Puckering, the youngest and only surviving daughter of Sir Thomas and Elizabeth Puckering. She was 7 when her father died. She was reported to be extremely weak, indeed a very skeleton. The priory lay mostly unused for several years, but still belonged to the Puckering family. As an heiress, Jane attracted male attention, with suitors hoping to marry her and come into the family fortune. When she was just 10, her mother, Lady Puckering, petitioned the House of Lords on Jane's behalf. The 3 executors of Thomas Puckering's will had got their hands on large sums of his money and taken little Jane to live with a complete stranger called Sir David Cunningham, who happened to be related to one of the executors. As her ward, under the terms of Thomas's will, he would stand to gain upon the death of this weak and sickly child. She needed her mother more than ever. The House of Lords listened to her mother's request and Jane was returned to the family home. At last there was some peace, and the mother began to look for a suitable husband for her teenage daughter. In the autumn of 1649, aged about 16, on a visit to London, Jane went for a walk in Greenwich Park, accompanied by one of the family servants. Quite suddenly she was seized from behind and bundled into a waiting coach by a man called Joseph Walsh. A boat was waiting for them on the Thames. Jane was pushed inside and it set sail for Dunkirk. Once there, she was forced to marry Joseph Walsh. Lady Puckering informed the authorities. The Council of State made arrangements to get Jane back. A Mrs. Magdalene Smith was sent to Dunkirk with letters to the parliamentary agents. A Mr. Frost was sent to confer with the French ambassadors. Their efforts paid off, and by November, a ship was sent to Flanders to collect Jane and bring her home in comfortable style. Once she arrived home, the lawyers set about making her false marriage null and void. Lady Puckering soon arranged for Jane to be married to a suitable match, choosing Sir John Bale, 1st Baronet Bale of Carlton Curlew in Leicestershire. He was 34 years old and a staunch royalist. They were married in 1651. Now Jane soon became pregnant, but her health continued to deteriorate. She died in childbirth, aged around 19, on the 27th of January 1652. This was the end of the Puckering era as such. Her husband, John Bale, died in 1654, 2 years later, and did not inherit the family estate, as Jane's mother Elizabeth was still alive. So the estates passed to Jane's cousin, Sir Henry Newton, born in April 1618. He was the second son of Thomas Puckering's sister, Catherine, and Sir Adam Newton. Thomas Puckering had already passed on his lands in North Kent. Henry Newton took the name of Puckering and moved to Warwick Priory. He'd already succeeded to the title of baronet of his father's estates. He was educated at Eton, admitted to the Inner Temple, and received an MA from Cambridge on the King's visit there in 1632. He travelled abroad in 1635 and then married Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Murray of Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire. They had 4 sons who all died before their parents. At the outbreak of the First English Civil War, Sir Henry Puckering raised a troop of horse for the king. He was present at the Battle of Edge Hill. After the king's defeat at the Battle of Naseby, however, he sought to make terms with Parliament, and in 1646 his fine was fixed at £1,273. The Commons pardoned his delinquency in 1647, and he was about to join the king's forces in Essex in June 1648, when he was seized by order of Parliament and only released on promising to live quietly in the country. He returned to Warwick. His wife's cousin, John Bowers, became MP for Warwick in 1649, and he inherited the priory at Warwick, but sold it a few years later to Henry Wise, the royal gardener. In August 1656, Sir Henry Puckering received a visit from John Evelyn, the writer, gardener and diarist. Both Puckering and his wife supported distressed cavaliers. At the restoration of King Charles II, Puckering was appointed Paymaster General of the forces. His sons, including Henry, died before him. Young Henry was also a lawyer and was MP in his father's name from 1661 to 1664 in the Cavalier Parliament, but he died aged 26 in 1664. In 1661, Henry Puckering was elected as MP for Warwickshire, and he held the seat throughout the Cavalier Parliament of England, which lasted from 1661 to 1669, the longest English Parliament, lasting for nearly 18 years out of the 25-year reign of Charles II. On 6th of February 1679, he was elected as an MP for the Borough of Warwick. His activity as a Justice of the Peace, together with his leniency towards the Roman Catholics, made him unpopular. In 1691, he gave the bulk of his library, including the famous Milton manuscripts, to Trinity College, Cambridge, and afterwards, for a period, was in residence there. He died intestate on the 22nd of January 1701, aged 83, and is buried in the choir of St Mary's, Warwick. The hidden legacy of Puckering's Lane, the Warwick Apprenticing Charity, Priory House, so extensively remodelled by the Puckering family, The story of one of Warwick's moneyed families working with royalty, justices of the peace, members of parliament, royalist fighters, and an abducted heiress. Puckerings Lane, Warwick, 82 metres long with only 4 addresses, a little lane hiding a big story. I hope you enjoy the rest of Warwick Words History Festival.